There comes a moment in every person's life when the pain stops being emotional and starts becoming physical. It's no longer just sadness or frustration. It's a heaviness that lives in your bones. You wake up in the morning, and before your feet even hit the ground, your mind whispers, "I can't do this anymore." Maybe it's the business you've been building for years that still hasn't taken off. Maybe it's the relationship that feels like it's draining the life out of you. Maybe it's the quiet war inside your head, the voice that tells you that you're not enough, that you've already lost. You scroll through your phone, see everyone else moving forward, smiling, achieving, and you wonder, what's wrong with me? Why can't I keep going like they do? You tell yourself to push harder. You drink more coffee, fake more smiles, go through the motions, but deep down, something inside you is starting to collapse. The hope that used to keep you alive is flickering like a dying flame. And it's at that exact moment, when you feel like there's nothing left to give, that something extraordinary can happen. Because when everything breaks, you finally have a chance to rebuild it the right way. There's a word in Japan that captures this idea, a word that helped an entire country rise from ashes after one of the darkest periods in human history. It's not just a motivational quote or a feel-good phrase. It's a way of living that turns suffering into strength, failure into fuel, and pain into purpose. The word is Gambaru. You might think it's just another piece of foreign wisdom, like Zen or samurai spirit. But Gambaru is different. It's not about pretending everything is fine. It's not about smiling through disaster. It's about enduring, fighting, and refusing to let circumstances decide who you are. It's the quiet fire inside people who rebuild after loss, who work in silence while the world doubts them, who rise not because it's easy, but because they've already known what it feels like to fall. And today, I want to show you what Gambaru really means, not as an idea, but as something that can change the course of your life. It's not theory. It's a true story about a young man who had every reason to give up. No money, no family, no future, yet discovered something that most people throw away at the first sign of struggle. That something didn't just save him, it rebuilt him. Before I tell you his story, I want you to take a deep breath and think about this. What part of your life have you been quietly suffering through? The dream that feels impossible, the responsibility that's crushing you, the weight that no one sees but you carry every single day. Because the story you're about to hear isn't just about Japan or about history. It's about you. It's about what happens when you decide that even when everything inside you says, "I can't," you do it anyway. And that decision, that moment of defiance, is where everything begins to change. Japan, 1947. The air still smelled of smoke and dust. The war was over, but what it left behind was worse than the war itself. Silence, hunger, and hopelessness. Cities that once pulsed with life were now wastelands of rubble and ash. Men who returned from the front lines were shadows of who they once were, and millions of families waited for fathers, husbands, and sons who would never come home. In one of those small forgotten villages lived a 19-year-old boy named Kenji. He wasn't a soldier, a scholar, or a hero. Just a young man trying to keep his family alive. His father had died during the war, leaving behind a wife, 2 younger sons, and an aging grandmother. The small wooden house they lived in barely stood upright. The nights were cold, the rice scarce, and hope rarer than food itself. Every morning, Kenji would wake before sunrise. He'd step into the frozen soil with bare feet and go work the same dead land that hadn't yielded crops in months. His hands were rough, his stomach empty, and his heart heavier than the tools he carried. He could see the disappointment in his mother's eyes, not because she blamed him, but because she was afraid for him. The youngest brother, Taro, often cried from hunger at night, while the middle one, Ren, asked questions Kenji didn't have answers to. "When will things get better, big brother?" Kenji could only force a smile and say, "Soon," but inside, He didn't believe it. There were no jobs, no opportunities. The war had taken not just lives but dignity. Even the proud men in town had stopped making eye contact. Survival had replaced pride, and every day felt like a punishment for being alive. Kenji had tried everything: hauling lumber, trading scraps, offering labor to farms miles away. But there was simply nothing to offer, and no one to pay. One morning, desperate and trembling from hunger, he set out again to the neighboring village to look for work. The sky was gray, the wind sharp enough to cut skin. After hours of walking, he reached a farm and asked the owner, an older man with tired eyes, if there was any work to be done. The man shook his head. "I'm sorry, boy. I can't even pay my own workers. Go home." That was it. The final thread of hope snapped. Kenji walked back home in silence, each step heavier than the last. He could already imagine his mother's face when she realized he'd failed again. When he finally reached the small wooden doorway of his house, he didn't go inside. He sat on the cold ground, knees pulled close, staring at the dirt. The quiet was unbearable, and for the first time, he allowed himself to cry. Not the tears of sadness, but the hollow, defeated cry of a man who truly believes he's reached his end. He whispered to the empty sky, "I can't do this anymore. I've tried. I swear I've tried, but I can't." His voice was barely audible, but it carried the weight of every man, woman, and child who had ever felt powerless. He thought maybe this was it. Maybe life had decided for him. And then, out of nowhere, a shadow approached. A pair of calloused hands, a calm, steady voice. "Is everything okay, young man?" Kenji wiped his face and looked up at the stranger, an older man with kind eyes and a quiet strength. His name was Tida, and his arrival was about to change everything. Tida wasn't a rich man, nor did he look like one. His clothes were worn, his hands rough and scarred, and yet there was something about him, a calmness that stood in contrast to the chaos around them. He didn't rush Kenji or speak down to him. He simply looked at him, the way an older man looks at someone he once was. "Are you looking for work?" Tida asked. Kenji hesitated, afraid to hope. "I am, but no one is hiring." Tida nodded slowly. "I have a small carpentry shop in the next town over. It's not much, but I could use some help. The pay is small, but you'll have food, and you'll learn something useful if you're willing to work hard." Kenji blinked, unsure if this was real. He hadn't eaten properly in days. "You'd really hire me?" The old man's lips curved into a faint smile. "I'm not hiring your hands, boy. I'm hiring your heart. The rest I can teach." The next morning, Kenji arrived at the workshop before sunrise. The place was small, smelling of sawdust, tea, and old wood. Tools hung neatly on the walls, and the sunlight broke through the cracks of the roof like gold dust. For the first time in months, Kenji felt something unfamiliar. Purpose, but it wasn't easy. His palms blistered from the saw. His muscles burned from lifting heavy planks. His back screamed at him to stop. Yet every time he wanted to quit, he remembered the quiet strength in Tida's voice. He couldn't disappoint the man who had seen something in him when no one else did. One evening, after a long day, they sat outside the workshop drinking warm tea. Tida turned to him and said, "Kenji, do you know what Gambaru means?" Kenji shook his head. "No, sir. It means to persist, to give your best, to keep moving forward, even when everything in you wants to stop." Kenji frowned slightly. "But how do you keep going when there's no reason to?" Tida smiled. "You don't need a reason, boy. You need a decision. Pain and failure aren't signals to stop. They're signals that you're growing. The trick is to stop fighting the pain and start working with it." Those words didn't fully sink in at first, but they lit a spark, a small one, faint and flickering, but alive. The next day, Kenji worked harder. He watched how Tida's hands moved with grace and precision. how he treated every piece of wood like it had a soul. When Tita carved, it wasn't labor, it was art. Days turned into weeks, and though Kenji still struggled, something inside him began to change. The boy who once cried in the dirt now woke up with quiet determination. He began to realize that Gambaru wasn't about never feeling tired or broken. It was about standing up anyway. And Tita, in his quiet way, kept teaching. "You see, Kenji," he said one afternoon, "after the war, I lost everything too. My house, my family, my will to live. But I chose Gambaru. I chose to start again. One nail, one plank, one breath at a time. That's how Japan will rise again, not through miracles, but through men who refuse to quit." Kenji looked at the old man and finally understood. Gambaru wasn't philosophy, it was survival. And that spark, that word, was about to turn his entire life into something worth fighting for. The days that followed weren't filled with inspiration, they were filled with pain. Real, physical pain. Kenji's hands bled so often that the cracks between his fingers burned when he touched water. His back ached from carrying wood heavier than he was, and every night he collapsed on the tatami mat, muscles trembling, vision blurring. Yet every morning, before the sun rose, he was back at the workshop, sweeping the floor, sharpening tools, and bowing to his teacher. Tita never praised him directly. He didn't give long speeches or pat him on the back. He simply watched, quietly, attentively, correcting him with a single word or a slight nod. When Kenji's hammer struck too hard, Tita would murmur, "Feel the wood." When Kenji rushed through a task, Tita would say, "Slow is smooth, and smooth becomes fast." At first, Kenji didn't understand these lessons. He thought work was just work, hitting nails, cutting boards, surviving the day. But slowly, he began to notice something. His hands stopped tearing as easily. His breathing steadied. His movements became precise, deliberate, almost rhythmic. The pain didn't fade away. It transformed. It became his teacher. There was one night that stood out. After working late, Kenji sat by the dim light of a small oil lamp, looking at his bandaged hands. He flexed them and smiled for the first time in weeks. Those scars weren't proof of failure anymore. They were proof that he was still here, still fighting. Tita walked in quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. "You're learning," he said. Kenji looked up, confused. "Learning what?" Tita sat down across from him. "That the body can only grow through strain. The mind is the same. Pain is not the enemy, Kenji. It's the invitation. It asks you, do you want to remain the same, or do you want to evolve?" Kenji looked down at his hands again and realized the truth in those words. His body had been resisting pain all his life, running from it, cursing it, fearing it. But now, for the first time, he understood that pain wasn't trying to destroy him. It was shaping him. Over the next few months, his entire rhythm changed. He worked not to escape suffering, but to move through it. When his muscles screamed, he whispered to himself, "Gambaru." When he made mistakes, he fixed them without anger. When exhaustion pulled him down, he thought of his family and kept going. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the boy who had once been broken began to rebuild himself from the inside out. And then, just as Kenji began to find his footing, life tested him again. Tita, the man who had become his mentor, fell ill. The old carpenter handed him the keys to the shop and said, "You'll have to manage it for now." Kenji's heart froze. "Me? Alone?" Tita smiled weakly. "You've learned the tools. Now it's time to learn yourself." Kenji stood in that small workshop the next morning, the silence deafening. For the first time, there was no one to guide him, no one to correct his mistakes, no one to tell him when to rest or when to keep going. It was just him, the wood, and the echo of his teacher's voice. Pain is where you grow. The true test of Gambaru had just begun. When Tita fell ill, The workshop fell silent. The rhythmic sound of hammer and chisel that had once filled the space was replaced by an eerie stillness. Kenji stood in the doorway, staring at the rows of tools neatly hung on the wall, each one waiting, each one reminding him that now everything rested on his shoulders. He had never run anything in his life. He was just an apprentice, still unsure of his own worth. But Tida's words echoed in his mind. "You've learned the tools. Now it's time to learn yourself." Those words became both a comfort and a burden. The first day alone was chaos. Orders had to be filled, customers had to be met, and every mistake cost precious materials they couldn't afford to lose. Kenji's hands trembled as he cut the first plank, his mind replaying every lesson he'd learned. But fear is a cruel teacher. It makes your hands hesitate, your confidence falter. The first table he tried to make collapsed before it was even finished. He could have quit right there. He could have said, "I'm not ready." But instead, he whispered one word to himself. Gambaru. That became his prayer. Every time he failed, every time his muscles shook, every time doubt screamed louder than courage, he repeated it. Gambaru. He worked through the night, guided only by the glow of a small lantern and the memory of Tida's patience. His fingers blistered, his eyes stung from exhaustion, but his spirit refused to collapse again. Days blurred together. The table he was building was more than a project. It was a battle between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. Each mistake forced him to adapt, to slow down, to breathe. He stopped seeing errors as proof of weakness and began seeing them as part of the process. Then one morning, as light streamed through the cracks of the workshop, Kenji stepped back and looked at the table. It wasn't perfect. The edges weren't symmetrical, the polish uneven, but it was strong, honest, and built with everything he had. When the customer arrived, a wealthy merchant, he examined the piece in silence. Kenji braced for disappointment, but then the man smiled, placed a hand on the surface, and said, "This is the work of someone who cares." That single sentence shattered months of doubt. For the first time in his life, Kenji didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel like a boy trying to survive. He felt like a man who could build something lasting. When Tida returned weeks later, he found Kenji asleep beside the finished table, sawdust covering his clothes. He smiled. "You did it," he said softly. Kenji opened his eyes, exhausted but proud. "Because of you," he whispered. Tida shook his head. "No, boy, because of Gambaru. I just gave you the wood. You found the will." And that's when Kenji truly understood. Gambaru wasn't about strength. It was about endurance, about carrying the weight of life and continuing to move, even when every part of you wants to stop. Months passed. The seasons changed, and so did Kenji. His hands no longer shook when he picked up a saw. His back didn't ache the way it used to. He worked with a calm focus that made time disappear. The little workshop that once smelled of struggle now carried the quiet rhythm of creation. Ted had essentially recovered, but when he walked back into his shop, it wasn't the same place he had left. Everything felt sharper, more alive. The air carried a new kind of energy, the kind that comes when pain has been turned into purpose. Kenji greeted him with a humble bow, expecting correction, maybe even criticism. Instead, Teda walked slowly to the workbench, ran his fingers along the polished wood, and nodded. "You've grown." Kenji smiled, unsure how to respond. "I tried my best." Teda chuckled. "No, you became your best. That's the difference." Word spread quickly. Customers began returning, asking for pieces made by the young carpenter. Orders increased, and soon, Kenji was earning enough to bring food home regularly. His mother's eyes, once clouded by worry, now held a faint light of relief. His younger brothers no longer went to bed hungry. They started to believe again, not in luck, but in effort. But Kenji's greatest reward wasn't the money. It was what he felt inside. For the first time in his life, he walked with quiet confidence. He didn't need to be told he was capable. He had proved it. To himself. Through every blister, every sleepless night, every failure he refused to let define him. One evening, as the two men shared tea under the fading light, Teda spoke again. Kenji, people think success is about reaching something. A position, a title, wealth. But real success. He paused, gazing at the sunset. Real success is when you can look at what you've built and know it was done with honesty, with your whole soul in it. Kenji nodded. He finally understood. Gambaru wasn't about reaching perfection. It was about persistence with integrity. About doing something fully, even if no one notices. It was about fighting quietly in the dark, until one day, the light catches what you've made. Years later, as Japan slowly rebuilt itself, small workshops like Teda's became the backbone of the country's recovery. Ordinary men like Kenji, once invisible, broken and poor, became the living embodiment of Gambaru. They didn't just repair buildings, they repaired the spirit of a nation. And though Kenji never became rich or famous, he built something far greater, a life with dignity, meaning, and self-respect. His story spread through the towns as an example. The boy who rebuilt his family, his purpose, and his future, with nothing but his bare hands and one word: Gambaru. Teda watched his student with quiet pride. "You see, Kenji," he said one last time, "the strongest wood is the one that survived the storm." Years later, Kenji's story would become more than just an inspiring tale told in villages. Psychologists, neuroscientists, and philosophers would describe the same truth he had discovered through pain: that persistence isn't just emotional, it's biological. The brain itself changes when you refuse to give up. Modern neuroscience calls this process neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself through repeated effort and challenge. Every time you push through difficulty instead of surrendering, your brain forges new neural connections. It becomes stronger, more efficient, more resilient. That means the simple act of persisting, of saying one more try, when your body screams enough, physically reshapes who you are. Researchers like Angela Duckworth call this grit, the ability to sustain effort and passion for long-term goals. According to her studies, grit is a stronger predictor of success than intelligence, talent, or even luck. And what's fascinating is how similar this concept is to what Japan has lived and breathed for centuries. Gambaru. Kenji didn't have scientific papers to read. He didn't know about neurons, or dopamine, or the growth mindset. But his brain and his spirit were proving the science right. Each failure taught him emotional endurance. Each success, no matter how small, rewarded him with confidence. Pain had become a feedback system, teaching him how to adapt, not retreat. Even Carol Dweck's research from Stanford shows this clearly. People who believe they can grow through effort achieve more than those who think ability is fixed. They face challenges differently. Where others see proof of inadequacy, they see opportunity to improve. That belief, that choice, changes everything. And here's the paradox: the pain doesn't disappear when you persist. It transforms into information. Your body learns efficiency. Your mind learns patience. Your spirit learns humility. That's the secret. Teda had understood long before science could explain it. Pain is not a punishment. It's the body's signal that transformation is happening. Just like wood must be cut, sanded, and shaped before it becomes a masterpiece, humans must endure friction before they reveal their strength. When Kenji built that imperfect table, he wasn't just crafting furniture. He was crafting his nervous system, teaching his brain that effort leads to growth. That's the real legacy of Gambaru. It's the alignment between the ancient wisdom of endurance and the modern science of adaptation. And yet, there's a catch. Because when you understand how powerful Gambaru can be, you also have to learn its danger, the fine line between resilience and self-destruction. And that's where the world today keeps getting it wrong. In today's world, Gambaru has been twisted. What was once a quiet strength, the calm persistence that rebuilt lives and nations, has been replaced with noise. Hustle culture screams, never stop. Sleep is for the weak, and people confuse burnout with bravery. The original meaning of Gambaru was never about destroying yourself for a goal. It was about preserving dignity through effort. But somewhere along the way, that balance was lost. Modern society worships speed and visibility. We glorify the man who works 20 hours a day, not realizing he's falling apart inside. We praise the woman who never takes a break, ignoring that she hasn't smiled in months. We've taken a philosophy born from patience and turned it into performance. And then we wonder why everyone's exhausted, anxious, and disconnected. True Gambaru isn't about doing more. It's about staying aligned with purpose. It means giving your best in a way that's sustainable, honorable, and real. The Japanese understand something subtle. Persistence without reflection becomes blindness. You can't just keep pushing without asking yourself why. Because if your effort isn't guided by meaning, it becomes self-punishment dressed as discipline. Tida used to say, "A dull blade doesn't cut faster just because you swing harder." That's how most people live now, hacking away at life without sharpening their intention. They confuse movement with progress, noise with results. Gambaru teaches the opposite. It teaches restraint. It teaches the value of stillness before action. The danger isn't in working hard. The danger is in working endlessly without direction, in forgetting that rest is part of endurance. The samurai trained hard but also meditated. Craftsmen worked long hours but bowed to their tools before touching them. They understood that persistence without gratitude is just ego in disguise. So when people today brag about never stopping, never sleeping, never feeling, they've missed the soul of Gambaru. The true warrior of life isn't the one who burns out chasing everything. It's the one who learns to pace himself, who knows when to strike and when to breathe. Kenji didn't rebuild his life by working until collapse. He did it by showing up every single day with presence, discipline, and humility. He gave his full effort to each piece of wood, then let go. That's what modern life is missing: presence. If Gambaru means to endure, then its shadow over Gambaru means to destroy yourself pretending that's noble. And that's the trap of our time. We think pain alone equals progress, but Tida would disagree. Pain teaches, he said, but only if you listen. So ask yourself, are you enduring with purpose, or just enduring because you're afraid to stop? Because one leads to strength, the other leads to collapse. And that question leads us to the final truth about Gambaru, not as a story from the past, but as a mirror for your own life. Now, I want you to pause for a second and think, where in your life are you standing at the edge like Kenji once did? Maybe it's your business that keeps failing, no matter how many times you try. Maybe it's your relationship that feels one breath away from falling apart. Maybe it's the quiet battle you fight alone, when nobody's watching, the part of you that just wants to rest, to stop, to let go. Whatever it is, this is your Gambaru moment, the crossroads between surrender and strength, the place where the world sees nothing in you, but your future is watching to see what you'll do next. Because Gambaru doesn't ask you to feel strong. It asks you to move, even when you don't. It asks you to get up when logic says it's pointless. It asks you to face another day, even when you have no guarantee that tomorrow will be kinder. Kenji thought about quitting every day. Even after his success, the difference wasn't that the pain vanished. The difference was that he learned how to walk with it. He learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to continue despite it. Maybe that's what you need to understand right now. You're not weak for wanting to give up. You're human. But what defines you isn't the thought of quitting. It's the choice you make right after it. Do you collapse, or do you Gambaru? Because one decision One single moment of defiance can change everything. Not because the world suddenly gets easier, but because you get stronger. You stop waiting for perfect timing. You stop hoping for rescue. You stop blaming fate. You start moving. One step, one act, one effort at a time. And eventually, something shifts. Maybe not dramatically, maybe not overnight, but one morning, you'll wake up and realize the weight on your shoulders hasn't disappeared, yet somehow you're carrying it better. That's the quiet miracle of Gambaru. It doesn't erase the struggle, it transforms the struggler. Kenji didn't become famous. He didn't escape hardship, but he rebuilt his family, his dignity, his soul. His name was never written in history books, yet his spirit helped rebuild a nation. And now, the same choice lies in front of you. You can keep waiting for the pain to end, or you can decide that this pain is the beginning of your discipline, your rebirth, your legacy. So when life pushes you to your limit, when you whisper, "I can't take another day," remember Kenji, remember Tieda, remember Gambaru. Because this is where your story doesn't end, it begins.